We began in the last lesson to talk about systemic leadership, about the various systems that leaders today do well to understand and lead within. One of the most important of those systems is actually not new. It's something with very strong roots in organizational management and leadership. And that is the system of behaviors in organizations and in markets that can be understood under the word culture. Culture, as Ben Horowitz, the venture capitalist, wrote in 2019, isn't a magical set of rules that makes everyone behave the way you'd like. It's a system of behaviors that you hope most people will follow most of the time. And I think that one of our challenges when we develop our leadership of systems is to appreciate that systems are not only technologically grounded or related to far-reaching relationships in markets or industries or societies, but may involve something much closer to home. So in this lesson, I want us to focus on culture. Again, both some of the historical formulations and approaches to understanding culture and ultimately changing it, but also some more recent ways that leaders can adopt as they work together with those on their teams and in their organizations to change culture together. Probably the most famous of models of culture actually emerged in the 1980s. Edgar Schein, a longtime faculty member at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, developed what has come to be known as the iceberg model of culture. And this iceberg model is, as the name suggests, represented by three different levels of cultural analysis. The first level is above the surface of the water, as it were. In other words, it's visible, it's apparent. Very little, in fact, of the cultural iceberg is visible to us. But for Schein, it's important, especially for symbolic reasons, to understand the actions, what he saw as the artifacts, the behaviors that help to constitute the culture in a given organization. Do people show up early and stay late? Do people mostly work and admit as much for money? What is it that individuals keep in their offices? Are they photos of their families, photos of clients? Is it examples of the products being made? What are the artifacts? In a lot of creative organizations, what is most visible about culture is how colorful and untraditional many of the workspaces are, or how untraditional much of the dress that employees come to work in. It's about tennis shoes and jeans, t-shirts. Now this is something which, again, is not new. One of the greatest of all advertising executives, Bill Bernbach, said back in the 1960s that he didn't care if he had workers come to his agency, DDB, with sandals, jeans, t-shirts, and love beads. He just wanted them to work hard and be as creative as possible. So one of the challenges that leaders have is engaging every day the visible, above the surface of the water components of the cultural iceberg, but also understanding the two levels beneath the surface that they need to stay very attentive to. Immediately below the surface is what Edgar Schein referred to as espoused values in an organization. The espoused values of an organization are its mission statement, the CEO's letter in an annual report, the company update that is provided by video or perhaps in a all-hands town hall to employees at any given time. These are the values that leaders talk about, that claim define the organization. Sometimes they do define the organization, but other times they don't. Hence the exact term, not just the values of an organization, but the values that are espoused by the organization about itself. And then more deeply, we have a final level, far beneath the surface, the bottom of the iceberg in a way. And these are the unspoken or unconscious assumptions that exist in the organization. They may drive behaviors, but they're very hard for researchers or for executives to get at. How is it that people who work in an office really feel about the leadership, or really feel about the rules and roles that help to organize the way they work? What Schein was trying to accomplish in laying out these three different levels, two of them beneath the surface of the iceberg and not easily visible, he was trying to emphasize that culture may ultimately be about behaviors that, if we're paying careful attention, we can observe, but understanding what's behind those behaviors, understanding why it is that people behave in the way they do, generate the artifacts that they do, wear the clothes they do, that's much more difficult. And understanding that and acting on the understanding is what analysts of culture have tried to do better jobs with ever since Schein started with his analysis almost 4 decades ago. Now, while Schein was looking for specific values or examples of behavior or unspoken assumptions, he would primarily fix one or two different attributes, a value of loyalty, a value of money making, a value of creativity, to any one of these three levels. More recently, other scholars, Boris Groysberg of Harvard Business School is one, has argued that cultures can be partly understood by looking at dominant values or dominant assumptions that individuals express either vocally or through their behaviors. But Groysberg believes that it's many times more helpful not to fix one value as defining the organization, but rather to understand that the culture of a given organization is, in many cases, defined by a tension between different values. And so what he and colleagues developed was a model of culture that specified 8 different major cultural descriptors. And there is a link in your resources that will take you to a brief survey that enables you to plot where on this grid that Groysberg has generated, your own company's culture exists. But again, the crucial distinction is that while Groysberg uses terms like learning or purpose or caring or authority or safety to describe the culture of a given organization, what he's most interested in is not the single most important attribute, but the tension between the top 2 or 3 most prominent attributes. What does it mean, for example, that there is both a purpose-driven culture and a results-driven culture that exist in a given organization? The answer may be as simple as there are 2 different groups of people who coexist but are ultimately pursuing different goals and are driven and behave for different reasons. But I think more often you have groups of people and companies who themselves are in tension. Much like we talked about in previous lessons about gaining a greater self-understanding and how different values that we hold as individual leaders are often in conflict. Our decisions, our behaviors are rarely the result of a single value. Rather, they're the result of values of ours that are in conflict with each other. And so the more as leaders we can understand that about ourselves, allows us to make better decisions. The more we can understand as leaders how those contrasting, maybe competing attributes or tendencies exist in an organization is going to help us to move the organization in particular ways, to emphasize certain priorities, to try to build up values or attributes that we believe best align with whatever our strategic priorities are, whatever the kind of humane workplace that we want to institute and sustain. But in order to do that, we need to be able to identify those competing values and be able to explore where they exist, again, in which groups of people, maybe which team leaders, maybe individuals related to specific products or functions, and then to determine how best can we proceed. How best, if we want to change culture, can we take the insights of these competing values and use them as a basis for constructive change, again, that are aligned with our other strategic and business priorities. Integrated culture is the term that Groisberg and his colleagues used. The idea was that it's not just a single value culture, but it's an integrated culture that integrates these different and, in many cases, competing values of culture that exists, especially in large organizations. Large and diversified organizations with maybe very different pools of talent doing very different tasks. Makes sense, right, that people would hold different values. The challenge, and for creative leaders the opportunity, is to understand those competing or contested values and use them as a basis for moving forward rather than getting stuck in contests between different groups or units that bring everyone down and reduce productivity, efficiency, or success. Now, I'll also say as a note that part of what Groisberg understood, and this is also an important observation that Schein made and other scholars of culture, no one culture fits all. I've mentioned previously in these lessons that I'm very attuned to what I call the Silicon Valley consensus, that a certain vision of organizations, of leadership, and yes, of culture prevails in Silicon Valley. The culture, we might say, is purpose-driven. It is about enabling individual talent to grow and develop as workers and as people. Leaders are meant to be stewards who are authentic and who lead by their values and who expect those around them to behave similarly, to behave authentically, to behave according to many of the same shared values. That's fine. And in general terms, that may be something many companies aspire to. But what Groisberg cautioned in his analysis of culture in this integrated model is that one size does not fit all. In the same way that no two companies should have exactly the same strategic priorities or should have the same portfolio of different operational plans, process improvements, and so forth. Every company, every organization should in fact be committed to developing its own culture. And again, because of the importance that Groisberg also mentioned of aligning an individual culture with these other strategic and business priorities, all of those together should indeed be unique to a given organization. That said, having a caring, nurturing, sincere culture like Silicon Valley, that works in many places, but recall the previous lesson of the leadership that some have argued works best in very turbulent environments, in a market like Russia or in Brazil. Here again, we're connecting dots. Those are not markets where companies with caring, nurturing cultures and leadership have prospered. Rather, there are other kinds of culture, maybe more interdependent than dependent, maybe more stable than flexible, and that's a response to the context in which these companies are operating. And it's not better, it's not worse, but it speaks to an understanding of context and of leaders who are willing to adapt, not hold to a certain model, not hold to a certain set of assumptions about what kind of culture or what kinds of values are always and everywhere best. We may want to start with a default set of values that allows us to support and nurture and enable everyone in the organization. But finally, we need to align whatever values we bring as leaders in developing a culture and understand how those relate to a lot of the other business priorities and strategic imperatives that help to define the firm. Now, culture change is a great challenge. And while one of the advantages of moving from a single attribute or value model of culture to the kind of integrated model that Groisberg talks about is helpful when it comes to leaders and others trying to effect culture change. But let me lay out for us some tips that come out of research. Some of them are very much related to what I've said about Groisberg's project. But I think all of them will be differently helpful in general terms to those who want to understand their cultures better, but also want to potentially change or nudge forward culture in different ways, again, aligned with some of the other future plans and priorities that we have as leaders in organizations. The first of these is, as I've said, that it's best to recognize that culture is defined by a set of tensions. And the more that we can appreciate the tensions and perhaps associate those tensions with specific groups, with specific people, with specific activities, the farther ahead we're going to be in terms of addressing them and, as appropriate, to changing them. We need to know what we're working with. We need to know what the data are. And when it comes to culture, data are hard to come by because data, as we'll get to in a few minutes, is not typically gathered around a lot of the critical ways that we come to understand culture. If we understand what the competing tensions are, competing values in a given culture, part of what we as leaders, as well as other people, need to develop is a willingness to learn, first of all, about why those tensions exist, but also to learn about how to move everyone forward, or at least the vast majority of people. Culture change projects are notorious, and rightly so, for leaving some people behind. And leaders often need to acknowledge that 100% culture change is unrealistic. We don't want to spend 90% of our time on changing the minds of the last 10% of the people who are resistant to culture change. But the larger point here is that starting from a place of cultural tensions, of values, or of key beliefs, that requires us to learn what in fact are possibilities for working with the competing behaviors and ultimately the people behind the competing behaviors and values in ways that doesn't simply choose one or the other as the future culture of the firm. Rather, we need to be willing to learn, we need to be willing to adapt so that we're not choosing culture A or culture B, but from the tension between the two, we're going to be able to work with the people who embody both of those cultures in order to create something altogether new. That's not easy. It requires a commitment, it requires a great deal of learning, again, both from the leader and others. Articulating culture change aspirations is essential. In fact, communications need to be constant around culture change. Culture change can appear to some workers as a kind of crisis. And we can look at this in the language we've been using as a great challenge or shock to the system that they have helped to make and live in at work. So we need to be able to over-communicate without overwhelming individuals, but make very clear that there's not a simple formula or a simple goal of a culture change project, but rather an ongoing willingness to learn together and to develop a new culture that better suits and reflects everyone's priorities and everyone's values. The last thing to say about culture change really picks up on this question of aligning culture with other aspects and priorities of business. And I think that one way to think about this is that a culture change project is not simply about changing the videos that the CEO sends out or about the letter that appears in the annual report. Rather, it's about understanding that a desired culture change needs to be manifested in and reinforced through almost everything that a business does. The larger business environment, every link in the value chain, interactions with clients and other stakeholders, process and organizational design improvements, and workflows. And I think the more that culture change from the start can be identified very crisply and analytically by leaders, the better chances a culture change has in terms of informing all of these different aspects and layers of organizational life. Now, just a quick comment. Some research over the last 2 years or so has emphasized the hybrid nature of changing culture in what are called traditional organizations. That is, organizations that perhaps were not digital-first organizations. And oftentimes, a great culture change accompanies digital transformations in these older legacy companies, mature businesses. And the one point I'd make here, which I think can be vitally important, is that culture change should not be wholesale change, except in the most drastic of situations. Combining the traditional practices or traditional behaviors that have existed in legacy companies, mature business cultures, combining some of those, after careful determination of which continue to be valuable, with more innovative practices is what many companies are finding most useful. In other words, if in legacy companies there are groups of employees, there are long-standing and well-refined practices, if in fact a lot of the mature business that the company has come to rely on and in fact engages in quite successfully and efficiently, it's not necessarily the case that we want to throw all that out. Rather, the challenge becomes merging those traditional behaviors or practices with new and innovative ones. And again, there's good research that shows CEOs and top leadership teams that take the time to identify which traditional practices and behaviors are working, which are not, and which new and innovative practices need to be adopted. And then combining those, they have the best chance of success, both in terms of culture change, but also driving business success going forward. Now, just to call out one thing which I said just now in passing, because it's absolutely essential. Just as we referenced in an earlier lesson about how hard it is for us individually to give up or to let go of specific practices, behaviors, routines that we have as individual leaders, so it's very hard for companies to let go of long-standing practices, cultural artifacts, assumptions that they may have held for years or decades. So again, in bringing together the traditional and the innovative to remake culture, part of what we want to do is face the very difficult task of deciding these traditional practices and behaviors, we want to keep them. They're going to be part of our future going forward. But these others, we're going to have to let go. And that's going to affect some people in very serious ways. It may affect some different units or departments, but it's absolutely crucial that, again, like us, we are willing to let go of practices and behaviors, cultural elements that no longer serve the company overall. And of course, we figure out what are the innovative practices that we can put in their place. So we build new innovation practices, we preserve some traditional practices, but we reorient or we finally retire other traditional practices that we deem aren't right for the new combination culture going forward. So just a quick note on what I mentioned is a very difficult challenge when it comes to assessing culture and also assessing culture change. How do you measure culture? Culture is, as some like to refer to it, it's a warm and fuzzy aspect of organizational life. Yes, it's about behaviors, but it's about how people feel. And so there are both general assessments that we can make of organizational culture, but there are also some business KPIs that we want to be sure to bring into the process, again, of a culture audit or assessment in the first place, and then ongoing tracking of culture change projects. For general assessments, certainly there are employee experience and satisfaction surveys, organizational commitment and burnout inventories, creativity and innovational climate studies, and we can also look at behavioral KPIs that are increasingly built into the larger set of KPIs that a lot of firms are committed to. The business KPIs in particular, client feedback, production team feedback, and so on. Many of us have very specific business or industry oriented KPIs. Figure out how it is that those business KPIs can also reflect the cultural aspects of what's happening in the business, behavioral aspects of what's happening in the business. And then lastly, what I would mention is a kind of final model. I talked about Schein, mentioned Groisberg. I want to talk about Daniel Coyle. Daniel Coyle published in 2018 a book called The Culture Code. And his approach was very simple, at least at the high level. What Coyle referred to was something that is very particular to companies and teams that operate in ways like we discussed in a previous lesson about psychological safety. And that is that the culture code for Coyle has three different elements. One is to build safety and collaboration. Do people on your team, in your organization, in fact, feel safe? Do they feel like they can collaborate fully as themselves? Two, and relatedly, is there a culture in which individual employees can share their vulnerability and passion? This follows the work that we did talk about in previous lessons from Amy Edmondson and others, Bren Brown talking about vulnerability. These are really crucial attributes of a productive, creative culture in many contexts. And for Coyle, there's a third, equally creative element to the culture code, and that is telling the group's story in order to establish or at least to cement their purpose. So we build safety and collaboration, we share vulnerability and passion, and we tell a story to establish purpose. For COIL, these three different elements work together to drive a successful creative culture.